thank you all for joining us today for our TBSigma 75th anniversary history panel on Fortitude. Today we have a number of sisters of TBSigma with us who have served in a variety of roles within the organization over the years, who will be able to share some of their inspiration and stories about Fortitude through their time in Currents and through moments of history within our organization. For this panel, we are recording this, so please ensure that as a participant, your camera is turned off. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will answer them as soon as we see them or get to that point. And thank you all again once for joining us, and thank you to our panelists as well. I will look over to this side because I have all of everybody on my side screen, but thank you to our panelists for sharing your time with us this afternoon, and I am excited to hear what great things you all have for us today. And so to start us off, the definition of fortitude is courage in pain or adversity. And we all see the word fortitude often in our favorites, 8 or 5 of TBSigma. I'm sure it's everybody's favorite. Fortitude and courage to see an ideal, seize upon it, and follow it wherever may lead you in TBSigma. And with that, we have our panelists who will be able to share their moments of fortitude. And as we go through, actually, can I ask you all, what does fortitude mean to you? And as you answer your question, tell us who you are, what chapter you're from, and what role you have served in the sorority. So Lisa.
You would make me go first. Lisa Crosston, I'm the National Historian, as well as your new National Events Coordinator for Kappa Kappa Psi TBSigma National Headquarters. Fortitude to me means several things, and I could name many different instances throughout my tenure as a member. I would say my greatest fortitude was being named National Historian the first time, and actually forwarding through or going through with getting things right and digging in all of our history and bringing a lot of this to light to share with all of our members. So I'll stick with that.
Very nice. Adrian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adrian Rawl, and I currently serve as the National President for TBSigma. To me, fortitude can be something as seemingly insignificant, though I don't think it is, as making it through a tough day. We have all had tough days lately, and I think that it takes fortitude sometimes to just get up in the morning and do what you have to do to make it through. So it can be something as small as that, and it certainly can be something as large as, you know, working towards something even though it's scary, working toward a goal even though it seems insurmountable or you see all the obstacles in the way. Keeping your eye on the end game, on the end prize, and knowing that you can make it through everything to get to what you want or what you know is best or what you need, whatever that end game is, that end goal, making it through all of that. So that's what fortitude means to me.
I love it. Karen.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Miller Hammond, and I was National President 1999 to 2001, and I'm a proud graduate of Baylor University and the IOTA chapter. So much like what Adrian just said, because of my association with TBSigma, I've learned a great deal about fortitude. And there's several things I could share, you know, in dealing with my time and leadership. But most recently, I'm the head of school for an Episcopal day school, a preschool, and I opened this school, and I opened the school in August whenever everybody told me I shouldn't. And thankfully, I'm glad I did, because it's made a huge difference. But I'll tell you, it was because of much of what I gained from my time in Tau Beta Sigma that I was able to press forward. And also how I was raised. So I completely agree with what Adrian said.
Yes. Dr. Kelly.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Catherine Garrett Kelly. I am a proud double graduate of Howard University. Shout out to our new Vice President-elect, Kamala Harris. I'm from the Eta Delta chapter, and I served as national president from 2015 to 2017. Fortitude for me, I think it changes as you go through life. Like when I was younger, I don't know if I really thought about fortitude as anything. And then as I've gotten older, a big part of it for me is standing strong, especially when it comes to the things you believe in and doing the right thing in certain situations. And I think, for me as a healthcare professional right now, fortitude is kind of sticking with it through all of this and wearing a mask every time and still having the courage to go out and see patients. I also work with the homeless population here in Montgomery County. And so making sure that those people are taken care of and that we are taking care of the least of us is an important part of what I see as a part of my fortitude and what I do every day.
I love it. And thank you for taking care of the people in your community every day. Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Foster. I'm a life member of the TAW chapter at the University of Houston. I am currently the chair of the Tau Beta Sigma Alumni Association. And I'm going to pull back the curtain and let you know that Siobhan gave us a spoiler and we knew this question was coming. And so I thought about it. And what I thought of was, in the 8, it talks about fortitude and courage. So it defines courage as different from fortitude. And so when I thought about like the stuff I've gone through in Tau Beta Sigma and life and everything else, I see fortitude as your willingness to take on the world. It's going to be messy. It's going to be disappointing as much as it's going to be encouraging and nice. And it's your ability to, stand up and say, whatever comes, I'm ready. And you can then spin that off into courage, meaning, taking on the challenges specific to your day. For me personally, I think of fortitude. When I was a student, I was told, you're showing good leadership skills. You should run for district office. And at that time, my district, the Southwest District, had never had a boy in leadership, and there weren't very many co-eds at the time. So
probably I'm not going to.
Okay. So, I had to have a little fortitude and a little courage to stick my neck out and go, I know you haven't seen people who look like me very often, but pick me, choose me. I'm trying not to quote a movie. So that's what I think of when I thought of fortitude.
And you're very right. I actually just Googled the definition of courage, and according to Google, it says the ability to do something that frightens you. And so, wow, fortitude and courage, like it's terrifying sometimes, but we have to keep pushing forward. I love it. Jean, bring it on home for us.
Sure. I'm Jean Newman. I'm a life member of the Zeta Xi chapter at San Diego State University, and I was national president from 1993 to 1995. A short version is ditto to what all these other folks have said. I think fortitude for me is no matter what, knowing that you can achieve whatever that is you're trying to achieve or complete or do or see or be. Just believe that you can, and that's 50% of the journey, right? And find people who will support you on the way. And as others have said, don't be afraid to share your ideas, share your thoughts, share your beliefs, because that's how we learn from each other every day.
I love it. Yes. And so thank you for sharing what fortitude means to you. And it definitely took a lot of fortitude to even just start this whole idea and this fun thing called Tau Beta Sigma. Lisa, you've done a lot of historical digging and diving and snooping, as we call it, into the early years of the sorority. What type of obstacles did the tech band sorority have to overcome during the founding of our organization?
Thank you, Siobhan. I usually chalk it up to three major, there was three major blockers, and one is communication, because back in those days, you know, you didn't have Zoom or Skype, or you didn't have even the telephones were hard to and very expensive to use. So everything was written by letters and took a lot longer. The other was, I don't know, this little thing called World War II kind of got in the way of things happening. And so the third was drama. A lot of drama through Kappa Kappa Psi and greasing the wheels to make things happen. So that was their biggest obstacles right there. And so the first marker was Wava wanted to join Alpha Omicron Kappa Kappa Psi. They said, no, we want only men. So then she took two of her fellow band sisters, and they formed their own group and became a local campus group. Then they wanted to go national, and that's where there was a lot of obstacles, a lot of blockers there. They were originally going to be an auxiliary to Kappa Kappa Psi, and that didn't work out very well because of the war. Everybody wanted them to wait, and so they repetitively were told to wait, to wait, to wait. And finally, after 7 years, they just decided that it was best to go on their own instead of being auxiliary. And so even then, the laws within the Corporation of Texas said, you're welcome to join here, but you have to do it yourself. And these women in this group decided that it was better for the sorority to strive and become national and work together, and where there's things already established. So they did that instead of trying to fight the fight by themselves. And so they turned everything over, and that was the biggest obstacles. And that's why it took 7 years to actually become a national organization. And then you'll see throughout the rest of this panel, there's been many, many more challenges coming down the road, but that was the first obstacles, and that it took 7 years to at least get us to the point to start.
Wow. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm thankful that they did, take those challenge and, the courage to do what terrified them and start an organization. So thank you all. And so as we move forward, the sorority became, organization. And in the 1950s, we started to see a huge push in growth for the organization. I think in that time we picked up about 20 or so chapters. How did the sorority kind of respond to such a large boom in growth overall during that time?
Well, the simplest answer right there is because there was already a Kappa Kappa Psi chapter. So there was already one there. They wanted an outlet for the girls. So their growth came from basically word of mouth. Both students went out and formed Kappa Kappa Psi chapters, and now these students wanted all their girls to have a place too. So all of the big growth at the first was where there was a Kappa Kappa Psi chapter, there was pretty much going to be a Tau Beta Sigma chapter. And then later on through that, and Karen can speak a lot of this through some of the stories with Janet, the groups came together. So when there was a call on, when a new university or college wanted to put a chapter on there, they were both done at the same time. So then you see a big growth in both the organizations because they had an outlet for both. Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that as much as some of you may not agree with that concept, was what it was back in that time. And you also have to remember that that was a period of time where there were a lot of college university band programs that did not allow the girls to march. And so, not to sound sexist, because I am far from that, the Tau Beta Sigma served as, they had a particular role that they served within all of their programs. Oftentimes that was receptions and that was cleaning, and whereas with Kappa Kappa Psi it possibly was building, it was doing more of those things, a lot different than what I'm sure, even though we still do those things now, but it was really, really different. The other thing also was that what you saw was you saw the relationships between the band directors, the directors of bands, and their wives, and that the band directors were the sponsors, which were men of Kappa Kappa Psi, and their wives most always back in the 50s and 60s were the sponsors for the Tau Beta Sigma chapter. So there was those relational type things. So and even so, Tau Beta Sigma was still the little sisters, so to speak. And it would have, and we'll talk about this further going forward, but it wasn't until the late 60s when there was a particular president, Patsy Drury Hale, who really pushed forward with that. But that didn't make it bad. It didn't make it bad. There's a lot of you that may not know some of my history. Some of you who have, and I know I see a lot of names that I recognize, but for those of you, my mother was Janet West Miller, who we lost on April 28th, but it's all good because she's doing great now. But she was a charter member of the IOTA chapter at Baylor, and it was exactly, this was in 1948, and the IOTA chapter and the Beta Alpha chapter came in together at the same time. So even going that far back, in 2 years of the start of the sorority, you were already seeing where, much like what Lee talked about, when there were new chapters of Kappa Kappa Psi, there was always a chapter of Tau Beta Sigma.
Well, that's so we moved together in lockstep, or is that an appropriate band term, with starting chapters through the 50s. And, we've continued that relationship this whole time. We're still friends and we still hang out with the brothers. So I'm thankful that we're able to still have chapters that, go on campuses at the same time, and have both Tau Beta and Kappa Kappa Psi serving our bands out there. And you kind of mentioned it, you talked about starting to talk about Patsy and, her position in really helping the sorority to be independent and stand on its own. I know that in 1964, A. Frank Martin retired as the executive director for Tau Beta Sigma Kappa Kappa Psi, and at that point, he had a lot of control over the day-to-day things of the sorority. And when Patsy became president and, after he retired, we had the opportunity to, see that ideal and follow it wherever it may lead us. So with going into essentially the late 60s and into the 70s time, we did have a lot of struggles, with, getting that balance on our feet with, coming into our own power and our own fortitude to control. What type of things did we do during that time to really establish ourselves in an organization? amongst the other ones out there as well. Lisa, what do you think?
Well, I'm thinking, right, as we begin to contribute a little more money to make ourselves more equal with Kappa Psi, they started standardizing procedures for colonization. They started, our board of trustees was starting to get more involved and was becoming more past national presidents and actual members of the sorority, where in the past, as Karen said, they were the wives or even band directors that were part of our board. And as I used to say, or as I tell many of you, yes, we were the little sisters and we were the nice adornment, and A. Frank Martin did so much for us that the men over here powwow, and then it's like, okay, let's bring them in and tell them what they're doing. And now we're making our own decisions and starting to stand up for ourselves. And actually, just this past couple of weeks, I've been going through a lot of Patsy's correspondence from when she was all her years on the council and board. And I'm finding where there's more and more fights of, well, now that we're paying equal for these commission works, when do we get to have a say in this? And they're like, oh, well, that's always been the men's role, or F. Lee Bowling, that's his baby, and I don't know about that. And so there's some kind of little controversy there going, well, yeah, we'll see about that. But there weren't the opportunities, because there weren't women band directors, there weren't women composers, there weren't women in this field. And so that was the man's field. And, they met at all these conferences and conventions and sat in the, bar talk, as we call it, and sat around and talked about all of this. And we weren't involved because there wasn't a role for us. And so they were just starting to break into that field, but they were the secondary education, they were the elementary education, they were the junior high or whatever, just getting into the high school. Nobody was on the college level. And so they're starting to break this barrier there and become important there. Does anybody have anything to add on that?
Well, what I wanted to say in dealing with Patsy in particular is that Patsy was the first president when they hired the first executive, well, at the time they called it executive secretary. And sadly, there were some shenanigans that took place, illegal shenanigans, and there was a time where both the fraternity and the sorority had to work together with that because it affected both groups. Mm-hmm. So it was very, very unfortunate. So, but I think Patsy was a band director. She was a high school band director, and she was married. Her husband at the time was a college band director. So she was also very different than what they typically had known, because you have to understand also, even going back into the 60s, and much like, going before that, once a woman got married, and let's say that they would be elected to the council one summer, and then 2 years later, sometimes 2 or 3 of them didn't show up to national convention for various reasons, but a lot of the times it was because they had gotten married, they had started a family, and it just wasn't, important. It wasn't, I shouldn't say important, but their focus was on their family. So even going into the 60s, you were still seeing that. So it was really at the beginning of the 70s where you saw a shift with our leadership in that way. And Patsy would have been one of the first ones as well. So.
And that's where they began reimbursing them a little bit. To go back on that, everything was out of their own pocket. So Janet was amazing because she traveled to all of these conventions and they were on her own dime. And all of these people, so they're right in that late 60s, that's where they were able to at least give them like $100 here, or just a pittance of money to buy a train ticket, or, you know, heaven forbid they buy a plane ticket, because they were so outrageous at that time. But everything came out of their own pocket as well. So when they got married, started families, the money was not as easily to them as well, that if someone was in Arizona, they couldn't travel to Storrs, Connecticut, or vice versa. You know, if they're in the East, they couldn't travel to the Southwest. So that became a big deal. And yes, as Janet, sorry, Karen, Janet. She's emulating Janet today. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
And I love that, like you mentioned that, Karen, about how, you know, there would be council members who would stop coming to things. I remember reading some of the national convention minutes from the late 50s, early 60s, and it'd be like, oh, so-and-so sent a telegram, sorry, she can't come. And that makes a lot of sense, where, you know, their duties had shifted to, you know, going directly to being, you know, mothers and wives, where, you know, even now, I personally have found a lot of inspiration seeing our members of our, you know, councils and our past councils becoming, you know, like Catherine had children and started a practice and did all the things. And a lot of us have, or not a lot of us, not me yet, but a lot of y'all have gone through these major moments in your personal lives and been able to use that as, you know, the fortitude to continue to serve, and using Tau Beta Sigma as an outlet as well. And I love it. And we're still in the 60s, kind of talking in that time frame. And the 60s, a lot of things were happening, you know, in the sorority, but way more things were happening out in the world. So during the 1960s, the US was still heavily involved with the Vietnam War. Civil rights movement was at its highest tensions. And we've had this question a number of times from our attendees, but how did the sorority respond to these type of world events? I know that communication wasn't the best. I know Lisa mentioned it, talking about the founding and how we had to wait weeks for a letter to get sent, but how did we really see the sorority respond to these type of events over the years, from anybody in the room?
Again, I'm trying not to hog all the conversation, so if anybody has it, but basically your podium and your news notes. That was how everything was relayed out. The podium came out twice a year. And then throughout the late 60s, I believe that's how early it was. In the 70s and the 80s, we had this thing called the news notes, which was almost like a newspaper quarterly type thing that gets you news faster. But we were definitely concerned with what was going on in the outside world, but not as much as like it is now, because you got your own information from your local area, and it was how you were doing in your local area. It didn't really affect the organization on a global as much as like World War II, when Kappa Kappa Psi went from 40 some odd chapters to 2. And like now with this COVID epidemic that is affecting so many of the universities and the chapters. So yes, all of these other things were tragic and affected global and regional and stuff here, but we were still able to kind of function. And by that functioning, it was just the information you got were how chapters were helping out in this cause, or what people were doing to volunteer their time, or the first thing I can recall, and Karen and Jean, you might remember something else, but there was a huge hurricane that hit in the late 90s. And so like University of South Carolina had, you know, so we give service certificates and stuff because they would write and do things on how they were helping the effort and doing stuff like that. So does that kind of answer your question, Siobhan, or anybody have anything to add to that?
I would say that it's important to remember how vastly different communication speeds were at the time. You know, I've talked to people from my own chapter that were around in the late 60s and 70s, and they were able to interact with, you know, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement locally because of things that were happening here in Texas. But I can imagine that with no internet and only your local newspaper, you know, it would be very difficult and just slow for the sorority to, you know, react in a much different way than we can do today. So, you know, those of you that are younger who don't remember those days, you know, you had to rely on a phone call from a friend to catch you up if your local paper didn't carry a story on, you know, this march or this speech from whomever. So, you know, the trajectory of history is slow until around 1995.
Right. And one of the questions from our attendees that was submitted was, having been in existence since 1946, and especially in a state that was segregated until 55, at what point, the question was about, you know, who was first, you know, admitted as a member of Tau Beta Sigma, who was African American. And I think that also kind of ties into, you know, the civil rights movements happening, you know, throughout that time. And how did the sorority, specifically in regards to the civil rights movements, handle like sit-ins and everything? And or would it be similar to, we cared, but we didn't have the communication ability to be able to talk to everybody during that time? Right. Yeah, I actually had the opportunity to meet with one of the founding members of the Beta Omicron chapter, which was our first HBCU chapter in 1958. And she talked about how members of their chapter were heavily involved in civil rights in the Houston area. And with all the conversations that we talked about that time and her experience and members of her chapter, I don't think she really said anything about, you know, Tau Beta Sigma intervening and saying, y'all need to stop doing that. It was more, you know, people in the city who said, we don't want that here. But, you know, even seeing some of those members, they're able to exhibit fortitude. And we had a lot of civil rights movements things, again, happening on campuses. I think colleges, civil rights in Vietnam's two big things in the 60s, like the colleges were, you know, the place where things started, you know, the A&T4, and then, you know, all of the different universities across the country still having sit-ins and this, that, and the other. And so I think that, and even I read something in the 1967 National Convention minutes, and Patsy said, you know, take what we've learned here at National Convention back home and lean on our values and use our values in your daily life. And I think if the sorority had any comments on how to treat people and how to do the things that you're going out there on your campuses and your world to do, it's to lean on our values, because our values is a platform, a foundation for you to be able to continue to move with courage through the things that terrify you, with fortitude as well. So yeah, 60s were interesting. Isn't that a song, Welcome to the 60s? Is that right? Or was it the different decade? Okay. So now we're leaving the 60s and going into the 1970s. A lot of things happened. We kind of talked a little bit about how things kind of started with Tau Beta Sigma in the 1970s, in which we continue to have really strong expansion onto new campuses. Persevered through allegations of embezzlement and a fire at national headquarters, managed not one, but two new national executive directors, and even the first proposal was put on the table for Tau Beta Sigma and Kappa Kappa Psi to merge into one entity. Through all these things that happened, and this is something that the whole group can kind of talk about, what was a major moment in our history in that decade? Is everybody going to say, well, being that somebody wanted us to start a merger?
Well, I mean, Title IX for sure in 1972, and how it ended up affecting us 5 years later. That's something I think of.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I can tell you from, and again, I was a child, but in 1977, the boards of trustees were called in early to the national convention, and then that year it was held at UCLA, Los Angeles, because the fraternity was having some financial issues, and they were needing some help, and that's where part of that, the idea of probably one of the first couple of times of talking about a merger had occurred. And I can remember my mother having to go to Los Angeles early, and so and I was like, was too big for my britches, even as a young girl, because I understood and knew way more than I probably should have as a 12 or 13-year-old, but I can just remember how emotional that was for my mother, for the women that were a part of all of that at the time. So that was an interesting time. Fortunately, it did not happen at that time, and things were okay. But it was, it was stressful. So, but I will tell you, dealing with bringing in men, I can remember. I believe it was, and Lisa, you'll correct me, and Jean probably will know this, but it was 1983 or was it 81 where would have been the members from Gamma Epsilon at Miami when they came to convention. And they kind of, Chris, you probably know this too, but
it was 89. It was at OSU.
Was it OSU? Okay, I wasn't at that one. So, and I can remember my mother. I was working outside of the country at the time, but I can remember talking to my mother, and she told me, "Do you know there were boys that came to National Convention?" Now, you all have to know that my mother was 91 when she passed away in April. So you just count back. She was still, but you know what? She loved everybody. But it was new and different, but it ended up being amazing. I married a member of Tau Beta Sigma. That's how I met my husband. So.
I picked up being a boy in the sorority in the relative early days of the 90s. I picked up a couple of stories. I'm, and if I'm wrong, Lisa or anybody can correct me. I believe the University of Miami in Florida was the first school that made the decision to only have one chapter, and it was TBS, or at least that way for a long time than any of our other schools. And without giving anything away, I can say that things such as the ritual and names and roles and words in the ritual were completely with feminine pronouns, feminine titles, and feminine terminology. And I could completely understand going, it's 1989. We've had at least one boy in the sorority for 12 years. And there are more of us now. And, if you're truly welcoming us, ... we need to be heard. And one time I visited national headquarters in Stillwater, and I got to see the minutes of that convention. And I remember a gentleman gave a minority report expressing their feelings and how they would feel more comfortable being called a brother of Tau Beta Sigma. And I was like, that's some fortitude and courage to stand up and go, I'm here. I need you to listen to me. We need to be heard. And so that's a big one. I know we've skipped around decades. Sorry, Siobhan.
Oh, and it's not, it all kind of connects to each other and a part of our history. And I think that with what you kind of started talking about Title IX and chapters becoming co-ed, that was a really big part. In 1977, the Gamma Kappa chapter at the University of Connecticut was the first chapter to initiate a male member. And since then, I think it's a really fascinating story. Since then, they've had a all male line. They keep a very good record of, the men who have joined their chapter, something that they're proud of, being one of the first chapters in the country. And with, Title IX and everything that is, us bringing in HBCU chapters and more diversity in general happening, beginning that point, how has Tau Beta Sigma become more inclusive overall since our founding in 1946? Adrian, what can you say?
Well, I think the answer is we're still working on it. I think it's something that we always need to continue to do what's right and to have fortitude and courage to continue on that path of inclusivity, because I don't know that we could ever be too inclusive. I don't think that exists. So I think a lot about 2020 has taught us that while we are a strong organization, while we should be proud of the work that has come before us, there's still work ahead, and that this is an area where we still have some work to do and some areas to improve upon. And so I am glad that we can sit upon the shoulders of those who came before us and of those who laid that groundwork and that foundation of our values so that we can continue to live them and be better.
And I just wanted to say, I think, because I didn't say anything when we were talking about the first Black chapters and things like that. And I think the biggest thing is I don't think we should sugarcoat what's been going on, because we didn't sugarcoat it before, is that, I'm sure that there were a lot of members during that time that felt the segregation that was there, because you also got to realize that these chapters were coming up in areas that were already segregated. And then, coming into the time we are now, there's still a lot of bias and a lot of miscommunication and misconceptions and stereotypes that go on among every group of people. But I know that specifically for HBCUs and specifically for our African-American members, whether they come from an HBCU or not, there's still a sense of other. And I think that, we have to do more to make sure that their voices are heard in that conversation, and that the history that we have is not whitewashed or male-splained or, made to put a pretty bow on it, because I think we can't learn from the things that we did in the past, and we can't grow and also get those people on board, because I think we all come together and we talk about, again, that fortitude for us to stand up for the things that we believe in. And we also, in doing that, want to make sure that others' perception of us is a positive one, and that really what's going on behind the scenes is that we're doing those things. And I'm not saying that that's not, because I do think that we made huge steps as we've come into 2020 and even before, of being inclusive and being accepting. And we're going to talk about later about some other things that were important. But I do think that there were those areas that we really have had to work on as an organization, and of also accepting culturally, and I think it's not just Black and white, because culturally we have Asian American, we have Latina members, and I don't think we do enough to celebrate their accomplishments in the organization as well. So when we talk about diversity and we talk about those things, we need to make sure that we're including those people and making them feel a part of the organization, and that it's not just a cut and dry Black and white. Because and as we grow and as we change, I think 2020 is a lot different. We could say a lot of different things that we said, and I came in 1998. I would never let come out my mouth, and if Facebook had ever heard me say them, but we're at a different place, in a different, of course we want to be in a positive place and we want to keep moving in that direction. But I really think that, when we stand by the things that TBS was founded on, and we talk about including women and including these ostracized groups, we also got to do a better job of making sure that we're not then saying it's only these two, and that there's more to that.
Absolutely. Sorry, I was on my second screen here and pulling a listing. I actually created a list of all of the HBCU minority serving predominantly Black chapters that we've established over the years. And since our founding, we've established about 80. And that is a mix of all of the different institutions that serve, like, Asian American and Pacific Islander, Hispanic serving, predominantly Black, and so on and so forth. And so we definitely have more opportunities to really shine lights on the culture of those chapters, because their chapters are different. And I think that, the work that we're doing and that we'll continue to do will continue to feed our mission and our values that way. But you're definitely right. When we, in my conversation again with the Beta Omicron chapter founder, number one, she didn't know that they were the first Black chapter until like a year ago. She didn't know. And since then, she told me that their director of bands wanted them to have Tau Beta Sigma on their campus, where Kappa Kappa Psi on their campus was founded maybe the year or so earlier, which was always also the first HBCU chapter for Kappa Kappa Psi. He wanted them to have an opportunity to network with other chapters and other directors of bands and other music students. But during that time, even she said, not to call your chapter, Chris, but the Tau chapter came across the street, installed them, and they went back across the street, and they didn't interact. And so it took a while for the sorority to, we've gotten to a point where, I always think of the Southeast District and my first convention there, and everybody is networking with everyone. And we've come so far with actually having that chapter's purpose for being founded being lived out in our districts and our nation. So yeah, I'm getting goosebumps over here. We've come so far, and we have a lot farther to go. So let's keep up the good work with Fortitude. And so moving on along, we also kind of dipped into it. We started talking about the 80s, and the 80s brought a lot of things out for us. Day glow and big hair, but it also brought a lot of big changes to the sorority. I know that in the 1980s, the sorority really jumped into a lot of things regarding professionalism. And I was at the 1987 convention where we actually adopted some of our first policies and started creating some of those major documents, which have still being used here for the organization, of course, with tweaks. For the whole group, how did the introduction of these things impact our members and the functioning of our sorority?
Well, I was one of those people. I was president. I entered University of Michigan in 1987 as the District 6 president, and I left it as the first Southwest District president because we also did our realignment. I will tell you that there had been a lot of work already done prior to the convention, and had really been done by previous district councils in working on the drug and alcohol policy and all of that. And this was before the question of insurance and all of that. And it was more just about trying to help make good decisions, make good choices, and also professionalism, as you stated. And again, going back to the way all of this was communicated, you have to know that, again, there was not a way to do a mass communication the moment we were walking out of Ann Arbor. Everything was put out through letter and through the podium, and then of course by the regional leadership as well. So it was really about helping our chapters to understand the responsibility of our roles at our universities, and how because we know, we've all had a good time, but it's about what did that look like. So that it was an interesting. I remember, and what I remember the most about that convention, aside from the realignment, was that there was hardly any discussion. There on Tau Beta Sigma side, I think we were very prepared for what that looked like and rolling that out. Lisa, you may, Jean, you may, but it was really fascinating because I think we were just at a time where we were ready to do that.
Well, I think it reflected the time on college and university campuses as well. So these items were being talked about at the university level, and maybe there were issues in Greek life on campus, and these things were being put into place to ensure student safety, right? And so it was just a natural sort of progression. And to Karen's point, I think Carla and her council and the district leadership, including the counselors, did a phenomenal job for 2 years of delivering a message of what these changes were and why they were important and how they would help us and what the future looked like with them. And when we got to Michigan, there was very little discussion. Everyone was in agreement that these were good decisions and good policies for the future of the organization. And thankfully that was the case, because anyone who was at Michigan and remembers those rooms that were 100+ degrees and no air conditioning, it was a very long week. So bless Carla and her team for making it happen quickly.
And I think you just mentioned Carla. I think that kind of goes into the next thing I know, Siobhan, I'm sorry, is that 87 also saw our first Black president. And I think that that's an important thing as we look into the influence of diversity in the organization, because diversity of thought is an important part. And it's not just a color thing. It's not just what your skin looks like, but where you're from, like seeing people from different regions and recognizing what things they have to add to that. I think also looking at the diversity of backgrounds too, because, you know, Tau Beta Sigma also has a lot of presidents and past national leadership that aren't just band directors. And I think that has led to us looking into our programming a little bit differently. And I think it may have started during that time, you know, with a change in the kinds of backgrounds that people came into the organization with and the skill set. And that allows us to look at it from a different professionalism standpoint too, because when you look at a board of trustees or a national organization that's just band directors and things like that, you also are losing some of those students who are very diverse and looking at how is Tau Beta Sigma going to add to what I do in my career long term. And I think that may have bolstered that conversation a little bit, because then you see accountants, you see other kinds of teachers, you see in my situation a physician, and all of the things I learned in Tau Beta Sigma helped me to manage myself in those avenues better. Like being able to run a national convention allows me to be able to run a business. Like being able to look at the board of trustees stocks and those kind of things helps me to know how to do that in my own life. And then to also have those areas of expertise as a part of our boards and a part of our board of trustees gives us a whole nother level of professionalism and you know, advisory boards and people within the organization that not only have that expertise, but also have the knowledge and the background in the organization to show their love for it and take it into consideration. And as you make decisions to pull that in. So it's a love and not just the law that goes into that whole conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said really validates my theory that Tau Beta Sigma gives you the skills that you need to be an outstanding human being, and even like skills that, you know, you're able to run your business effectively because of your experience running a chapter or running your, you know, a national convention. And so, you know, stick with it, you all. Shameless plug, stay with us. And, you know, I think what you said, you'd mentioned Carla becoming our first national president who is Black, and she was from the Alpha Gamma chapter, if I'm correct, at Kent State. And, you know, between the beginning in 1987, we had initiated about 25 HBCUs during that time. And of course, chapters from a number of other minority-serving institutions. And I think it's really cool to have that opportunity to that was like the beginning of us showing the inspiring our membership that they can be in this leadership role as well. And we'll continue on through our history to have, you know, more people and from, you know, different campuses and everything joining in to our national leadership team. And that kind of goes back to our inclusivity and showing you that you can be that leader and growing in Tau Beta Sigma that way. I love it. Yes. And so going back to my notes here, everybody.